February the 1st, the Myanmar military announced a major cabinet reshuffle and detained civilian leaders, including State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. Since then, protests have been ongoing. At least 233 people have been reportedly killed by security forces in the weeks of protests so far. On March the 14th, over 30 Chinese companies in the largest city and former capital of Yangon were vandalized, looted or burned. The attacks caused property losses of an estimated $37 million. Why were Chinese companies targeted? Who's responsible for heightened hostility against these Chinese companies? And what might have been the intention? Joining me for the discussion today from Beijing via Zoom is Professor Daojiong of the School of International Studies at Peking University, and also via Zoom from Cambodia, Professor Digby Wren, political analyst at Deakin University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Professor Zhang, let me go to you first.
Hello.
Now, after the military takeover and before the attacks on Chinese factories, protesters reportedly demonstrated outside the Chinese embassy, accusing Beijing of supporting the military's move. So exactly what has been China's position on the issue so far? As I've said, China has refrained from using the word coup. Instead, it caused this a major cabinet reshuffle, what happened in the beginning of February. Help us understand China's position here.
Relationship between China and Myanmar has traditionally been very, very complex. And Myanmar may, on the map, be a small country, but that country has a long history of pursuing its own path of development and its own foreign policy. You may recall back in the 50s and 60s, Myanmar did have a representative to lead the United Nations as Secretary General. People tend to forget that. If you look at the Bandung Conference of 1955, when it was really the first time that China showcased itself in the regional stage of diplomacy, Myanmar was one of the key proponents of what eventually became adopted here in China as the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Professor Wren, how do you look at, what's your observation of China's more recent attitude and position towards what happens in its neighboring countries, especially this time? And why do you think the Chinese government might have been at a loss? Because immediately it didn't have an opinion on this issue when the situation broke out in Myanmar. It actually said it needed time to study the situation.
Following on Professor Jia's statements about peaceful coexistence, the Chinese foreign policy towards Myanmar, and that is the same foreign policy for all of ASEAN, of course, is good neighborly relations, friendly, good neighbor relations. And with Myanmar, that of course has been extended into the Belt and Road development, and China has invested billions and billions of dollars into Myanmar, and that has in large part supported the growth, the economic growth over the last few years during the time of the civilian military government cooperation. It's a relatively stable cooperation. Yes, and I think, of course, they were surprised. The Chinese government was surprised. But I think what's the big surprise here has been the Indian involvement, and that was unexpected.
However, it seems,
I think.
Yeah, however, it seems that that was not much talked about in the press, but rather it has been insinuated or implied or, spread as a form of hearsay or rumor, unsubstantiated claim that China was supporting the military action and hence the kind of displeasure, resentment against the Chinese government or the local Chinese community. Do I understand the situation here, correctly, Professor Jha?
Well, you have to remember that Myanmar is a society whereby the sharing of information goes through multiple layers the country has rather spotty, should I say, schooling system. Much of the elementary school over there is schooling. It's done by the Buddhist monasteries. And the higher education there is a rather recent development. And then newspapers and the spread, the reading, they don't really have many newspapers locally. And much of the talk about what's going on in the country goes through the word of mouth. And now you have the sudden arrival of social media. So rumor mongering spreads rather fast, either about domestic situations or about a neighboring country, China.
I would concur with that
Professor,
comment that
go ahead,
Liu Xin about the social media. That this is a very sort of well-worn game plan now about how to spread misinformation and misdirect populations, especially naive, young, youthful populations of students who are not particularly highly educated and really have limited access to outside information. And this is very damaging to the Chinese reputation and has been used, shall I say, by external forces for their benefit.
So help me understand the sentiments there. Is there displeasure towards the Chinese government for its position, its rather not very clear position, who's supporting, whose sides it's on, or is it against the against Chinese investment locally, or is it against the local Chinese communities which have lived in Myanmar for generations? Professor Wren, your understanding of exactly which sentiment is being directed against who?
Well, the China is the obvious target. I mean, it's so easy because over the last few years, and actually, there's a historic ties, of course, with the Chinese in Myanmar, but so much investment has been put into Myanmar from China, construction, pipelines, ports, roads, and other assets, financial and industrial assets, that is, really supported the growth in the economy in Myanmar. So it's a very obvious kind of a target. It's not as if you see lots and lots of American or Indian or other investments in the country. So it's very easy to sort of point people towards that as being, exploitative or whatever. But obviously that is not true. But these people are easily swayed, and as Professor Jia has said, the internal divisions within society in Myanmar are really very deep and easily exploited. And that's really what's going on here. Not only do you have the political problems between the LDNP and the military and control, because that's the military's quasi-control of parts, important, significant parts of the economy, but you also have ethnic divisions, tribal divisions, and it's not necessarily clear, as Professor Jia has said, that the government has done a lot to try and help that in Myanmar. In fact, they've probably made it worse.
What do you think is Yeah, Professor Jia, very briefly, but I also want to know a bit about this. What about the external forces? Do you think there are any foreign influence that have probably a stake or interest in stoking, exploiting the kind of complexity or potential misunderstanding towards China's intentions and influence in Myanmar? Professor Jia.
It's not a secret that these protest tactics that have been employed in places like Hong Kong in the past few years are now being deployed in that society. Actually, if you look at the governments of Indonesia, Thailand, and less so Malaysia, certainly Singapore, they made a very strenuous effort to keep track of that. And in the Myanmar situation, those tactics got into play more fully, taking advantage of the weak governing structure in that society. To go back to Liu Xin's question, the foreign elements are at play, and you have a dedicated group of actors and individuals who, see protest as, if not the only way, but as certainly a very legitimate way to express dissatisfaction. They engineered certain social movements going back to the so-called Arab Spring. It's a complex situation.
All right. We certainly will keep a close watch on the situation. Many thanks to Professor Daojiong and Digby Wren joining us for this discussion.